see if I can bring some clarity to this. Come on back. Y'all stayed over there too long. Y'all stayed over there too long. I done completely lost you. You backslid that quick. This is the same message, and Jesus is coming to the end of it. He says, therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man, which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the wind blew, and beat upon that house. And it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. Touch somebody, say, I'm still here. I want you to see this. And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not, they just came to church, but they ain't gonna do nothing. They just here because you cute. They here because they was in town and they came to church and they don't want to be here. They went and me, hurry up and shut up. Everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. Come on. And the rain descended, and the same flood came, and the same wind blew, and it beat upon the house, and great was the fall of it. If you have the God code, it does not mean that you won't go through things, but it does mean when it's over, you'll still be standing. There are moments in your life where you're still counting it all up. And I came to tell you, don't stop counting.
You can walk in everything God has for you in 2021. Today, for your gift of any amount, you'll receive the 2021 Heavenly Royalty Calendar and Count It All Up, a revolutionary teaching from Bishop T.D. Jakes on how God's glory surpasses all of our troubles.
There is no comparison between what you are going through and what God has for you.
If you keep counting, seeking, and trusting, you will get all that God has promised. In addition, for your gift of $90 or more, you'll receive the 100 Bold Prayers Guided Journal, the God Will Supply My Needs prayer box and cards, the 2021 Heavenly Royalty Wall Calendar, and Count It All Up by Bishop T.D. Jakes. Start the new year off strong by remembering all that God has done for you. Take a bold, life-changing step in your faith today. Feel free to reach out to us on social media and share your story of how God is impacting your life. We look forward to seeing you next time on The Potter's Touch.
Hello, friends. The favor TBN has earned around the world is amazing. I recall not long ago sitting in Benjamin Netanyahu's office in Israel with Matt Crouch. He had shared on multiple occasions how very grateful he is for TBN's friendship and support of Israel over the years. TBN is having an impact worldwide as well as right here at home. When you support TBN, know that you are helping change the world one heart at a time. And that adds up to countless lives that will come to Jesus because you gave. To start the new year off right, would you consider making a monthly commitment or a substantial one-time gift to TBN? As our way of saying thank you for your gift of support in any amount, we will rush you Joel Osteen's latest book, Empty Out the Negative. Already the author of 10 New York Times best-selling books, this may be Joel's greatest yet. As we turn the page on the challenges of 2020, let's leave it behind. This is a must-read.
It may be tough now, but keep the right perspective. Victory is in your future. Healing is in your future. Abundance is in your future. Freedom is in your future.
My friends, your much appreciated tax-deductible gift to TBN brings the gift of salvation through Jesus Christ to millions around the world. Please call now, and thank you for partnering with TBN.
Anything you face in life, God has given you enough faith to overcome that situation. Because if I lose the house, if I lose the job, and I still have faith, I will recover.
Hey, this is Anthony Evans, and my story with TBN is that it has been a huge influence in my life, not just from sitting at home and watching and having it impact my life in a major way, but because of the influence and impact they've had by allowing me on the other side of the camera to minister on a platform that reaches far beyond any stage where I could sing live on. I'm so grateful for the influence that they've had in my life personally and the influence that they've had in my ministry life. So thank you so much for being a part of my story.
This is TBN.
Hi, I'm Dave Stotts from Drive Thru History. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is observed on the third Monday of January, which is around his birthday on January 15th. The federal holiday was created as part of the Uniform Monday Holiday Act and signed into law by President Ronald Reagan in 1983. At the signing, President Reagan said this:
Dr. King had awakened something strong and true, a sense that true justice must be colorblind, and that among white and black Americans, as he put it, their destiny is tied up with our destiny, and their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a remarkable champion of the civil rights movement in the United States, especially in the 1950s and 60s. Popularly, he is known for famous quotes such as, "I have a dream, we shall overcome, and out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope." The Reverend King was a remarkable man of courage who grounded his activism in biblical principles and steadfast resolve. Let's explore the life and legacy of this civil rights champion, starting with his formative years in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. This is a 1967 Chevy convertible Corvette. This was the final year in the number 2 body design, or the C2, which many collectors consider to be the iconic shape for the Corvette. Let's take a look under the hood. It's got a 327 cubic inch V8, which pushes 300 horses. And these cool side exhausts. And this will be our ride as we journey through the American South, starting in Atlanta. This is Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park in Atlanta, Georgia. This incredible 35-acre site includes MLK's childhood home, Ebenezer Baptist Church, his childhood church, and the King Center, established by his wife, Coretta Scott King, after his death in 1968. The park is also Dr. King's final resting place. This preserved area of Atlanta was converted from a National Historic Site to a National Historical Park in January 2018. The park contains a number of gardens, exhibits, and buildings, including this firehouse from 1894, which now houses the gift shop. Martin Luther King Jr.'s childhood home is located here at 501 Auburn Avenue in the historic district known as Sweet Auburn. MLK's grandparents purchased the home in 1909, and his grandpa pastored the Ebenezer Baptist Church about a block away. In 1926, MLK's father and mother moved into this house where he was born on January 15th, 1929. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., took over as the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church during Jr.'s childhood, and the King family lived here until 1941. As a reverend son, Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in church. From ages 3 to 6, one of his best friends was a white boy whose father owned a store across the street. Now, these houses across the street from MLK's childhood home are known as shotgun houses. They've been restored and maintained as part of the historical park district. A shotgun house is a narrow, rectangle-shaped house about 12 feet wide, with rooms arranged one behind the other. The doors were lined up from front to back to allow airflow in hot, humid climates. These were the most popular style of house in poor southern neighborhoods from the end of the Civil War in 1865 all the way to the 1920s. They are also known as shotgun shacks or shotgun huts. When MLK started going to school at the age of 6, he was sent to the all-black school in town and separated from his friend. Their friendship began to break apart until one day his friend's father demanded they no longer play together at all. MLK would later write that this was a formative experience in his life.
We were at the dinner table when the situation was discussed, and here for the first time I was made aware of the existence of a race problem. I had never been conscious of it before. As my parents discussed some of the tragedies that had resulted from this problem and some of the insults they themselves had confronted on account of it, I was greatly shocked. From that moment on, I was determined to hate every white person. My parents would always tell me that I should not hate the white man, but that it was my duty as a Christian to love him. The question arose in my mind, how could I love a race of people who hated me and who had been responsible for breaking me up with one of my childhood friends? This was a great question in my mind for a number of years.
MLK's childhood years in Atlanta reinforced the reality of segregation and injustice. He later wrote, "I saw that you could be treated unfairly just because of the color of your skin." This is the recently restored Ebenezer Baptist Church. Throughout its long history, this church has been the spiritual home to many citizens of the Sweet Auburn community. Martin Luther King Jr. was baptized here as a child and watched his father minister here for many years. When he was 19, MLK gave his first sermon here and was ordained a minister. After his formal education, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. returned to Ebenezer Baptist Church in 1960 to serve as co-pastor with his father, then known in the community as Daddy King. MLK served as pastor here until his death in 1968.
We will be able to speed up the day when the lion and the lamb will lie down together. I want to walk in the way of my Savior.
Thanks to a Save America's Treasures grant and the contributions of many individuals and corporations, the National Park Service recently completed the restoration of historic Ebenezer Baptist Church. It has been returned to its appearance during the 1960 to 1968 period when Dr. King and Daddy King served as co-pastors here. MLK went here to Booker T. Washington High School for 2 years, from 1942 to 1944. This was the first black public high school built in Atlanta, and it's still an important cultural institution in the community.
Booker T. Washington was a famous educator in the black community who started the Tuskegee Institute in Atlanta and wrote Up from Slavery in 1901. He once said, "I resolved that I would permit no man, no matter what his color might be, to narrow and degrade my soul by making me hate him." With God's help, I believe that I have completely rid myself of any ill feeling toward the Southern white man for any wrong that he may have inflicted upon my race. I pity from the bottom of my heart any individual who is so unfortunate as to get into the habit of holding race prejudice.
In 1944, at the age of just 15, MLK graduated high school and came here to Morehouse College in Atlanta. At the time, Morehouse was the nation's only college of its kind for African American men. At Morehouse College, MLK was mentored by great professors, theologians, and social activists. Dr. Benjamin Mays was the school's president and was considered a huge inspiration to King. Dr. Mays hosted weekly chapel sessions where he urged Morehouse men to be, quote, sensitive to the wrongs, sufferings, and injustices of society, and to accept responsibility for these ills. Martin Luther King Jr. also had incredible mentors in the sociology, philosophy, and religion departments, which inspired him to abandon his pursuits of law and medicine and enter the ministry instead. He was exposed to Mahatma Gandhi and his methods of nonviolent protest. He was introduced to Henry David Thoreau and his essay on civil disobedience. In the end, King realized what would make him the ideal minister. He would apply Christian principles and Christian traditions to social issues in the modern world. In King's final year here at Morehouse College, he wrote in the student paper, "We must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education." At the age of 19, MLK went on to seminary, ultimately earning a doctorate in systematic theology from Boston University. At this point, MLK was well on his way to applying a new style of Christian leadership to civil rights and social reform in the black community.
To this day, Atlanta has great pride in its hometown hero. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered on streets, schools, and statues throughout the capital of Georgia.
To share in the rest of our journey through the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I'm honored to introduce my special guest, Dr. Rick Rigsby, acclaimed motivational speaker, best-selling author, pastor, and former professor and scholar whose research and teaching focused on the rhetorical dimensions of the 20th century civil rights movement. Okay, that bio is a little longer than mine, but it's an honor to have you here, Dr. Rigsby. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Dave. I appreciate it. You know, that Atlanta segment is fascinating. I love the twists and the turns of history. I love learning about the nuances, and there's so much to pick up, as you know, with King's life. He goes right down the street after a wonderful childhood to enter college at Morehouse University. And here's something for you. When King was at Morehouse, he wasn't known for his oratorical skills. He wasn't known as a great student, but he is interested in ideas, and he knows that he wants to do something to advance humanity in some way. He thinks maybe I'll be a doctor, but he wasn't strong in the sciences. He thinks maybe I'll be an attorney, and he held on to that notion until he took a course in Bible. And in his words, after taking a course in Bible, King said, the shackles of fundamentalism disappeared. And He was faced with truths that were undeniable, biblical truths that he could no longer ignore. And that began a quest. How now can I use this to help people? And one of his mentors, President Benjamin Mays at Morehouse, said, listen, you can combine intellectual pursuits with pastoral care. You can combine that curiosity for knowledge with the ministry. So continue your efforts. And he continued. He goes to Crozer, does very well. They encourage him to go on for PhD studies, which he does at Boston. But the most significant thing about being at the university in Boston is that he meets a young woman named Coretta Scott, and they eventually end up at a little church called Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, and the rest is history.
Okay, so now let's get back to our drive-through history. About 2.5 hours southwest of Atlanta on I-85 is the next city on our tour through the American South. It's also a key location in the early story of Martin Luther King Jr.'s social activism. Next stop, Montgomery, Alabama. This is Montgomery, Alabama. It was here on December 1st, 1955, that an African-American woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. You see, Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, had a law on the books that required black people to give up their seats in the middle section of the bus after the whites-only section in the front of the bus filled up.
This is an exact replica of the National City Lines bus, number 2857, that Rosa Parks was riding that December day in Montgomery. It's currently housed at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. The original bus also survives, residing at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan.
And when the driver demanded that we give up this seat, I felt that the time had come to not take it anymore. I had had enough, and this was truly the end of being pushed around.
It was Rosa Parks' simple act of civil disobedience that launched a one-year social protest against Montgomery's public bus system. In the end, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the bus segregation laws in Montgomery and the entire nation as an unconstitutional violation of civil rights.
Here is the story of Martin Luther King Jr. and the famous Montgomery bus boycott.
On December 5th, 1955, just 4 days after Rosa Parks was arrested, a large meeting was held here at the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery. When organizers saw the huge crowd, they gave Martin Luther King Jr. 20 minutes to prepare a speech. The speech was a great success, and the black community enthusiastically agreed to support a boycott of the Montgomery public transit system. As you can see, historic Holt Street Baptist Church is now closed. It was shut down in 1998 and relocated to a different part of town. What a significant building. Another classic example of American history just waiting to be discovered on a drive through the American South.
Almost immediately, the boycott was effective. Martin Luther King Jr. called it a miracle. Instead of riding buses, the boycotters walked, cycled, carpooled, hitchhiked, and drove horse-drawn buggies. Many taxi drivers in the city supported the boycott by offering 10-cent cab rides to black passengers, matching the normal bus fare. Across the nation, black churches got involved by collecting new and slightly used shoes to send to Montgomery to replace the tattered footwear of its black citizens that were now walking everywhere. The Montgomery transit system had very few riders and quickly faced economic failure.
During this time, there was a major resistance from certain white factions. A number of black churches were burned, and boycotters were attacked. Activist leaders' houses were firebombed, including King's. At one point, hundreds of angry African Americans gathered outside King's burned-out house, demanding retaliation.
King responded, "If you have weapons, take them home. If you do not have them, please do not seek to get them. We cannot solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with nonviolence." Remember the words of Jesus. He who lives by the sword shall perish by the sword. We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us. We must make them know that we love them. Jesus still cries out in words that echo across the centuries. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. This is what we must live by. We must meet hate with love. Remember, if I am stopped, this movement will not stop because God is with the movement. Go home with this glowing faith and this radiant assurance.
Ultimately, Martin Luther King Jr. and 89 other boycott leaders were indicted for conspiring to interfere with an Alabama business under an old 1928 statute. Rather than waiting to be arrested, they all turned themselves in as an act of civil defiance. MLK was sentenced to 386 days in jail, but the sentence backfired and got the Montgomery bus boycott national attention. Due to the outcry, MLK was released after only 2 weeks. He said, "I was proud of my crime. It was the crime of joining my people in a nonviolent protest against injustice."
We still advocate nonviolence with passive resistance and still determined to use the weapon of love. We are still insisting emphatically that violence is self-defeating, but he who lives by the sword will perish by the sword.
On December 20th, 1956, 1 year and 15 days after the boycott started, the federal court issued a ruling against Montgomery's bus segregation laws. The U.S. Supreme Court later upheld this ruling, declaring all bus segregation as unconstitutional. Martin Luther King Jr. and his style of God-centered, nonviolent activism was now on the national map. So, Dr. Rigsby, why was Montgomery so significant?
That's a great question. Coretta and Martin leave Boston. He wants to do 3 things. He wants to, number 1, be a great pastor. Number 2, wants to finish his dissertation. And number 3, he wants to figure out a way how to put hands and feet on the gospel. Well, guess what happens in the process? Rosa Parks gets arrested in a city where there is political activism on the part of Negroes. 50,000 Negroes are very active. They have an NAACP that's headed by this awesome guy named Edie Nixon, whose secretary is Rosa Parks. So when she gets arrested, it starts a whole chain of events that culminates in a 1-day bus boycott. And on that night, at the biggest church in town, Holt Street Baptist Church, they decide to have this new preacher speak. Why? Because a couple of people had heard him, and he's very eloquent. And when he spoke that night, they had never heard anything like it. Here was one of his quotes. "We're not wrong. If we're wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we're wrong, the Supreme Court is wrong. If we're wrong, God Almighty is wrong." Ralph Abernathy said it took 15 minutes, Dave, to calm the crowd down. Guess what happens? After a period of time, the local folks form the Montgomery Improvement Association. Guess who they name as president? An unknown man outside of his congregation named Martin Luther King Jr. And Montgomery, with its success, literally sets the wheels in motion. Montgomery is significant also because it proved the power of unity. It proved that together anything is possible.
All right, so the next stop on our journey through the life of Martin Luther King Jr. is about an hour and a half north of Montgomery on Highway 459. Next stop, Birmingham, Alabama. In the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama was one of the most racially divided cities in the United States. African Americans faced huge legal, economic, and cultural disparities and violent retribution when they spoke up about them. Local leaders organized protests, sit-ins, and marches to pressure businesses to hire more black workers and open access to restaurants, schools, and stores. But this local activism was often met with local violence.
In early 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, based in Atlanta, came to Birmingham, Alabama, to support the local movement. They helped organize black students, activists, and churches in what was later called the Birmingham Campaign.
As a result, on April 10, 1963, a local circuit judge issued a blanket injunction against, quote, parading, demonstrating, boycotting, trespassing, and picketing. Leaders of the campaign, including Dr. King, announced they would disobey the unjust ruling. 2 days later, on April 12th, King and other leaders were arrested and thrown into the infamous Birmingham jail. I'm west of Interstate 65 on 6th Avenue South. That's Memorial Park on the right. And that's the Birmingham City Fleet Maintenance Shed on the left. And if you're not careful, you might miss this building. The Birmingham Police Department Detention Division, or as history remembers it, the Birmingham Jail.
Dr. King's Birmingham jail cell is long gone, but here's a recreation of it on display at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. The actual door from the cell is housed at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute here in Birmingham.
For decades, there was nothing at this site mentioning Martin Luther King Jr.'s incarceration here. Only recently, this memorial plaque was installed to honor the important event. And even more important, letter from Birmingham jail, which Dr. King wrote here on April 16th, 1963. While in jail, Dr. King read a newspaper article in which a group of 8 white pastors from Alabama expressed concern that the demonstrations he was leading as an outsider in Birmingham might be unwise and untimely. Dr. King penned a letter in response, explaining that he was in Birmingham because, quote, injustice is here. He famously declared, quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
The letter went on to lay the biblical and philosophical foundations for civil disobedience, nonviolent activism, and the civil rights movement that had spread throughout the South. King referenced major figures from Jesus Christ to Socrates, from Augustine to Aquinas, the Apostle Paul, John Bunyan, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, T.S. Eliot, and the American founders, all to ground his actions in our God-given and constitutional rights.
As a rational man, not just a black man, King said that he was guided by these profound thinkers in his efforts to lead the nation to fulfill the promise of America's founding. In his letter, he reminds us that there are just laws and unjust laws, and that we must look to God's eternal and natural law for ultimate guidance.
King wrote, "One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence."
Martin Luther King Jr. was released from the Birmingham jail on April 20th, 1963. He immediately returned to organizing demonstrations in the Birmingham campaign. On one occasion in May 1963, there was a walk from here at the 16th Street Baptist Church to City Hall in order to discuss segregation issues with the mayor. This walk resulted in the infamous images of the Birmingham Police Department, led by Bull Connor, unleashing high-pressure water hoses and police dogs against students and bystanders. was here at Kelly Ingram Park, just across the street from the church, where this event garnered national media attention. These statues are a sobering reminder of the violence related to the civil rights movement of the early 1960s. Later in 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church was the target of even worse violence when a bomb went off and killed 4 young girls: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, and Carol Robertson. Many consider this tragic event as the turning point in the civil rights movement. This statue, called the Four Spirits, was unveiled in 2013, the 50th anniversary of the tragedy, to honor the 4 young victims. Today, the 16th Street Baptist Church still conducts services. It is now a central landmark in this section of the city known as the Birmingham Civil Rights District. The church was also designated a National Historic Landmark in 2006. In the end, the 1963 Birmingham campaign was considered a model for civil action and nonviolent protest. The media jumped aboard and drew the world's attention to racial segregation in the American South. The campaign expanded Dr. King's national influence, ousted Bull Connor from law enforcement, and forced desegregation in Birmingham. In large part, the Birmingham campaign also paved the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited racial discrimination in hiring practices in public services throughout the entire United States.
After a Democrat-led filibuster during the presidency of John F. Kennedy, President Lyndon B. Johnson finally got the legislation passed in Congress with overwhelming support from the Republican Party.
Birmingham was the turning point of the civil rights movement. Here's the reason why. They go to Birmingham, and King is faced with a court order not to march. But he says, I've got to do something. Marches and gets arrested. By the way, Andy Young said that that was the beginning of his true leadership. When he didn't know what to do, I really believe he had to depend on the Holy Spirit to guide him. While he's arrested, the young militant factions, they planned Project C. Not only was Project Confrontation the most controversial move ever in the civil rights movement, but it was a decisive turning point. This was the strategy. We're out of money. We're out of protesters. Kids would love to get out of school. Let's use kids in the protests. And so the pictures that the world saw, Dave, were innocent children being attacked by police dogs and fire hoses. It embarrassed the Kennedy administration, and inevitably it broke the chains of segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, making Birmingham the critical turning point of the civil rights movement. Fred Shuttlesworth said it best. We knew that God was for us, and if God is for us, no one can be against us.
So as a result of the Birmingham campaign, Martin Luther King Jr. was now in the national spotlight as a leader of the civil rights movement. This set him up for his biggest speech on his biggest stage yet. It was the summer of 1963. Now it's time for us to take a quick road trip to our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Dr. King was the last speech on that hot summer day. He took to the podium here in front of the Lincoln Memorial to deliver an address to over 250,000 civil rights supporters. It became the speech that defined Martin Luther King's place in the civil rights movement. Near the end of his speech, Martin Luther King Jr. rolled into his preacher-like style when he declared, "I have a dream."
I say to you today, my friends, that in spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a desert state sweltering with the heat of injustice and oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Martin King's themes were unbelievable. Themes like time, now is the time. Not just answering the exigence of that day, but even going back to when he was in jail and receiving the criticism from the 8 Alabama clergy in a Birmingham jail. Why do you want to protest now? He's echoing, now is the time. We've waited too long. I love this theme. This theme of freedom in terms of words and imagery that his audience could understand. Listen to this. America has issued us a check stamped insufficient funds, but I refuse to believe that the vault of justice is bankrupt. That's powerful. Martin King delivered the greatest speech ever heard, arguably, and he did it in a way that really galvanized not just Negroes in America, but people interested in democracy. That's the significance of the I Have a Dream speech.
All right, so we're going to return now to Alabama, 1965, for the next chapter in Dr. King's journey. Our next stop, Selma. This is Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma, Alabama, a National Historic Landmark since 1982. This church served as the makeshift office for Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during the Selma Campaign of 1965. The Selma Campaign was primarily organized to fight the racially motivated suppression of voting rights in Alabama and the American South. Brown Chapel AME Church was also the starting point for the historic Selma to Montgomery marches. The Selma to Montgomery marches were 3 demonstrations held during March of 1965. They were organized as nonviolent protests to increase awareness of racial injustice and the voter rights movement in Alabama. The basic concept was to walk the 54 miles from here at Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma to the Capitol building in Montgomery, increasing protester numbers and media coverage along the way.
Don't give up, but in one great outpouring with the gentle sighings and the glad thunders of the ages, all of us can begin to sing, glory, hallelujah, our God is marching on.
We're marching up to Zion. We're marching. We're marching up to Zion. We're marching. We're marching up to Zion. We're marching. We're marching up to Zion. Oh,
the first of the 3 marches began on March 7th, 1965. This turned into the infamous Bloody Sunday, when armed police attacked marchers with billy clubs and tear gas as they were attempting to cross the Alabama River here at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The bridge itself has an infamous namesake, Edmund Winston Pettus, a former Confederate general, U.S. Senator, and Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the demonstrators were ultimately blocked and forced to return to the Brown Chapel AME Church. But it was these images that put the Selma campaign on the national map. The second march took place on March 9th, just 2 days later. Again, the demonstration met with police resistance here on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This time, Martin Luther King Jr. had joined the protesters. He led the group to obey a federal injunction against the march, and they turned around on the bridge, returning to the Brown Chapel AME Church to await a legal decision. This march became known as Turnaround Tuesday. That night, a key protester and visiting minister from Boston named James Reeb was murdered in Selma. Between the events of Bloody Sunday and the murder of Minister Reeb, Selma was making national headlines. Nearly 2 weeks later, with the support of the media and the courts, a third march left Brown Chapel AME Church and successfully crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge to start the 4-day walk to Montgomery. The third march followed U.S. Route 80 between Selma and Montgomery. US 80 is an east-west United States numbered highway, much of which was once part of the auto trail known as the Dixie Overland Highway. The 0 in the route number indicates that this was originally a cross-country route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. However, the entire segment west of Dallas, Texas, has now been decommissioned. In 1996, the National Park Service designated this portion of Route 80 as the Selma to Montgomery National Voting Rights Trail. There's an information center, and they've even marked various sites used as campgrounds during the 1965 marches. Since this is Drive Thru History, of course, we're going to drive the Selma to Montgomery National Voting Rights Trail.
Take me back to the river, wash away my sin. Take me back to the river, I'm gonna make my stand.
It was a march into the unknown, and tensions were at an all-time high. The Alabama governor, a Southern Democrat named George Wallace, well known for his segregationist views, had no intention of acquiescing to the demands of the marchers.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Lord, won't you help me to right these wrongs?
And we hope to see the greatest witness for freedom that has ever taken place on the steps of the Capitol of any state in the South.
It was here at the Alabama State Capitol that the third Selma to Montgomery march finally ended on March 25th, 1965. Approximately 25,000 protesters gathered at the foot of the Capitol steps here on Dexter Avenue. Martin Luther King Jr. and a number of other prominent activists led the group in an attempt to meet with Governor George Wallace and give him a petition requesting an end to racial injustice and the suppression of voting rights in Alabama. In part, the petition said,
"We have come not only 5 days and 50 miles, but we have come from 3 centuries of suffering and hardship. We have come to you, the governor of Alabama, to declare that we must have our freedom now. We must have the right to vote. We must have equal protection of the law and an end to police brutality."
They were denied entry, but Dr. King delivered one of his impassioned speeches at the base of the Capitol building steps. We are not about to turn around.
Yes, sir. We're on the move now. Yes, sir. Yes, we're on the move, and no wave of racism can stop us. Yes, sir.
Although the meeting never happened and the petition was never delivered to the governor, the media awareness was huge, especially in light of the terrible Bloody Sunday events a couple of weeks earlier. Collectively, the Selma to Montgomery marches had a major role in pushing the passage of the U.S. Voting Rights Act of 1965 just a few months later.
These steps at the Alabama State Capitol remain as they were in 1965, although repairs have been made during the 1992 renovation of the building. These steps have continued to be the rallying point for civil demonstrations over the years. Memorial Selma to Montgomery marches have ended here at these steps on several occasions since 1965.
I really believe this is a fascinating period in history because you have the established Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the head of the civil rights movement. But you got these young bucks, this young energy from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee saying, hey, listen, we really think that we can garner voting rights here in Selma. They get over their heads. They call for the elders of the organization, and they don't seem to be making any headway until their old dear friend Violence, a blessing to the civil rights movement, shows up on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It was a blessing because what it did was it created promulgation. Promulgation is a very important protest strategy because it always manipulates television. It gives you pictures that television cannot ignore. Guess what happened? About a month or so later, after King is on those courthouse steps in Montgomery, Lyndon Johnson, who had just successfully passed the civil rights legislation in 1964, the Public Accommodations Act, now says to the nation, this isn't just a Negro problem. What we're seeing in Selma doesn't just involve a segment of society. It involves all of us, and all of us have to overcome. And then he said these words, and we shall overcome. C.T. Vivian, a debutante of the civil rights movement, records the fact that all of the senior leadership, they're watching this and they're applauding lustily, except King. He's sitting quietly, and Vivian notes a tear streaming down his eye. So picture this. While a dagger is in the heart of the Confederacy, you have a tear down the cheek of Martin King.
Now, on April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to speak at the world headquarters of the Church of God in Christ. Although his flight to Memphis was delayed by a bomb threat, he still made it in time to deliver his speech, now known as the I've Been to the Mountaintop address. Near the end, he said this.
Well, I don't know what will happen now, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Now, after the speech, Dr. King checked into room 306 of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. That's the final stop in our tour of the American South. On Thursday, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was staying in room 306 here at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. In the evening, he went out on the balcony near his room.
At 6:01 p.m., a shot rang out. A single bullet entered Dr. King's cheek and went down his spinal cord. He fell violently backward onto the balcony, unconscious. Martin Luther King Jr. was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m.
The Lorraine Motel is now part of the National Civil Rights Museum here in Memphis, Tennessee. That wreath up there marks the approximate site of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Since Dr. King's death, the National Civil Rights Museum has become a complex of historic buildings and museums built around the Lorraine Motel, telling the story of the civil rights movement in the United States. The museum property was recently renovated to include a number of compelling multimedia and interactive exhibits. In 2016, the National Civil Rights Museum became a part of the Smithsonian Alliance.
'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus.
As a final farewell to his spiritual home, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral was held at his childhood church, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. He was laid to rest just a half a block away.
About 2 months later, James Earl Ray was arrested at London's Heathrow Airport and extradited to the U.S., where he was charged with the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. On March 10th, 1969, he pled guilty and was sentenced to 99 years in the state penitentiary here in Tennessee. This marked the end of an era, but the beginning of a legacy.
To really understand the scope of Dr. King's legacy, let's return to Washington, D.C.
This is the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial next to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It covers 4 acres and includes this incredible granite statue known as the Stone of Hope. Now, the inspiration for this design comes from a line in Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech when he said, "Out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope." This memorial opened in August of 2011 after more than 2 decades of planning, fundraising, and construction. Located at the northwest corner of the tidal basin near the FDR Memorial, the official address of the monument is 1964 Independence Avenue, commemorating the year that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law.
The official vision statement for the King Memorial states, in part, Dr. King championed a movement that draws fully from the deep well of America's potential for freedom, opportunity, and justice. His vision of America is captured in his message of hope and possibility for a future anchored in dignity, sensitivity, and mutual respect. A message that challenges each of us to recognize that America's true strength lies in its diversity of talents.
The inscription wall at the memorial contains 14 quotes from Dr. King's speeches, sermons, and writings. The earliest quote is from the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, and the latest is from a sermon Dr. King delivered at the National Cathedral here in Washington, D.C., just 4 days before he was assassinated in 1968. The quotes are not arranged in any chronological order, so visitors can engage with the wall at any point.
What an incredible life. Dr. Rigsby, give us some summarizing thoughts now on this man's amazing life and the civil rights movement he helped lead.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a once-in-a-generation kind of individual. He was a transformative figure, one of the most transformative figures in history. And no man is perfect. I would teach my students at Texas A&M when they would talk about Martin King's infidelity, I would say, you know, King David had infidelity issues, but I still read the Psalms. No person is perfect. And so I want to focus on his rhetorical legacy. This man could speak like very few others, and he spoke with not only clarity, but he spoke with a tone of love. And if you think about his rhetoric, that you shouldn't hate your oppressor. You should love your enemy. Listen to how biblically connected his rhetoric was, that if God is for us, who can be against us? Listen to the tone of his rhetoric, that we should turn the other cheek. I mean, Matthew 5 is a challenge. I mean, Jesus's words are real challenging. Turn the other cheek, walk another mile, give somebody your shirt. And this is what Martin King was saying. You show me any movement, past or present, without powerful, charismatic, salient, clear leadership, and I'll show you a movement that fizzles. That was not the case with Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement of the 20th century.
As Americans, we commemorate days of birth and days of death of notable figures in our history. We admire their character, we honor their courage, we remember their contribution, and we cherish their legacy. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination denied him the opportunity to see our nation fully respond to his courageous call for ending racial discrimination and civil injustice. However, his words live on. His speeches, sermons, and writings still connect us to transcendent truths that have yet to be fully embraced in America. They encourage us to be vigilant in challenging laws and actions that conflict with the Bible, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And for that, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day in America.
Dive into the pages of Jerry Pattengale's companion book that goes along with TBN's documentary series, Inexplicable. The most interesting questions in history. The answers to how Christianity became such a compelling religious movement on every continent.